Hi, welcome to Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner,
and Cathy Gillespie,
with students
Cara Chapman
and me, Tova Kaplan.
Join us as we discuss hot topic issues with constitutional experts. It's sponsored by Constituting America.
Constitutional Chats. Once again, I'm Janine Turner. I'm the founder and co-president of Constituting America. You may know my work as an actress, but I've been founder and co-president for 10 years now of Constituting America. So thrilled to be here. And with Cathy Gillespie, and as I said, Tova Kaplan and Dakare Chatman. So today, our hot topic is the Emancipation Proclamation, but not just the Emancipation Proclamation. We're going to talk about all the political intrigue surrounding the Emancipation Proclamation, all the things that were going on. Mr. Faulkner has brought in so many. It was a fascinating read. You're going to have a lot of fun, I promise. So as you know, that's our topic, and Scot Faulkner is our constitutional expert. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about Cathy Gillespie. Cathy is the co-president of Constituting America and is one of the only 16 private citizens on the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission, the very prestigious commission. Say that, everybody. Semi-Quincentennial, really hard to say. And she's helping organize a celebration of our country's 250th birthday in 2026. And I always like to say, a bird and an eagle needs a left wing and a right wing to fly. And without Cathy, I would just be flapping around with all my ideas and I wouldn't be getting off the ground. So say hello, Cathy.
We're a great team.
So that's Cathy. Okay. And Tova Love Kaplan is 16 years old. You're just not going to believe it when you hear Tova ask her a question. She lives in Illinois and she currently serves as our National Youth Director for Constituting America. And she runs the National Youth Advisory Council, and she does this brilliantly, I might add. She's a 3-time winner of our Constituting America's We the Future contest. Be sure to check that out on the website. She won Left Brain, Right Brain. Listen to this. Entrepreneurial, where she created a marketing plan. The next year, she won PSA, where she was very creative and created her own commercial. And the next year, she won for STEM, where she created an app. So she is very passionate about educating and empowering young people to use their constitutional rights. Say hello, Tova.
Hi, everybody. Glad to be here.
Oh, yes, we're thrilled that you are here. Next, Cara Chapman. Cara Chapman is our Constituting America student ambassador. He's 16 years old as well, is currently a junior and full-time college student in South Carolina. He has won Constituting America's We the Future contest, check it out, twice. Once for Best PSA, where he reminded the viewers it's an American thing, so know it, talking about the Constitution. Of course, I don't think he did it with a Southern accent like I just did. It's an American thing, so know it. in Texas. And he won again for The Man on the Street for short film, which is also fantastic, all available at constitutingamerica.org. He is actively involved in our National Youth Advisory Board with Tova, and he is a working actor seen most recently in HBO's The Righteous Gemstones and in Netflix, our Outer Banks, which was just released last week. So everyone check that out. The Righteous Gemstones for HBO and Outer Banks for Netflix. Dakare wishes to be an actor, but also a politician, but he believes you must be an actor to be a politician. So Scot Faulkner. Scot Faulkner is Vice President of the George Washington Institute of Living Ethics at Shepherd University. He was the Chief Administrative Officer of the U.S. House of Representatives. Earlier, he served on the White House staff. I believe this was under Reagan. Faulkner provides political commentary for ABC News, Australia, Newsmax, and Citizen Oversight. He earned a master's in public administration from American University and a BA in government and history from Lawrence University, with studies in comparative government at the London School of Economics and Georgetown University. Scott is coming from us tonight from Harper's Ferry, very near where many of these events happened to place. So say hello, Mr. Faulkner.
Hello there. Looking forward to a wonderful hour.
Well, we're thrilled to have you. And I just once again want to say that Scot Faulkner has written so many essays for us for Constituting America over the past 10 years, 25 essays, Mr.
Wow.
Faulkner has just, I know, written for Constituting America. And we're talking about his essay tonight, which is currently on it's part of our 90 and 90 day study, means 90 essays in 90 days, 90 and 90. And that's on the website at constitutingamerica.org. And we're going to be discussing his essay tonight. And as I said, he is very instrumental in creating this entire program for this year's 90 and 90. And also, we're going to talk a little bit about an auction very quickly. So Dakare and Cathy have something to say about the auction. You're on mute, Cathy.
Unmuted. Yes, thank you, Janine. We're just, we have an auction going on right now that is raising money for our Constitution education programs. If you go to constitutingamerica.org and look in the thin red line up the top of the website, it says click here for our auction. And one of the exciting items that we have on our auction is a VIP tour of Harper's Ferry with Scot Faulkner. So as you listen to Scott tonight and see how much he knows about Harper's Ferry, I know you all are going to want to take advantage of this wonderful auction item. And then I'd like to toss it over to Dakare real fast, because Dakare has actually very generously offered a VIP tour of Charleston, South Carolina. And Dakare is Charleston's youngest tour guide.
Yes, I am Charleston's youngest licensed tour guide, and I give tours all over the peninsula. And in the bidding, I offer 3 different tours to choose from. It's my basic historic Charleston tour, my love stories of Charleston tour, and my TV and movie tour, showing you all the TVs and movies that were filmed in Charleston. So The Notebook and Southern Charm and all those good, The Patriot, all those good movies. So hope you get on there and bid.
Okay, so check out that auction. It's only available for 4 more days, I believe, and that's also at constitutingamerica.org. I'm sure there's a button or something somewhere that tells you how to get to it, right? Okay, so now we have this fabulous essay. Look at my big font in print here, because you know I'm older now. Okay, Mr. Faulkner, I'm going to start off the first question, and I just was so incredibly intrigued about as I said, all the mechanism, everything that was going on behind the scenes with this Emancipation Proclamation. And I know we will need to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation in itself, but interesting about how the beginning of the war, it was all about disunion, and then it changed. It was about disunion at first because, according to your this wonderful essay that you wrote, Abraham Lincoln needed Maryland, and if he made it about slavery at that point, he would lose Maryland, and then Washington D.C. would be an island. But then later, and we're going to go into this in great detail, it shifts to about slavery. One of the reasons is because the European nations, Abraham Lincoln did not want England or France to side with the Confederacy. And if it was just about disunion, they probably would have done that. But since they had abolished slavery in their country about 30 years earlier, if it became about emancipating slavery, which I think was always Abraham Lincoln's mission, because he talked about it like we discussed last week in the Cooper Union Address. That's what he wanted, but he had to really negotiate how to please whom when, and he didn't want England to side with the Confederacy. And then in the end, Russia even becomes involved in it, but we're going to save that for the end, because I thought, wow, that's interesting. So I guess my first question to you is, you know what I always talk about the fact when I teach, and I've given over 500 speeches to students, but the Declaration of Independence, without the Declaration of Independence, I don't know that we would have had the unity to win the war under George Washington. And I think when George Washington read that Declaration of Independence to the troops. It gave everyone a focus. And I think that the Emancipation Proclamation is very similar in the respect that it was the unifying document that everyone then knew what they were fighting for and kept the states involved. It was very clear then what we were about. The foreign intrigue had to stop somewhat. So talk about for a second the Emancipation Proclamation itself, and how that was really as vital to the Civil War as the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence was to our Revolutionary War.
Absolutely. In terms of the actual pivotal moment of the whole Civil War, it was the Emancipation Proclamation, because it put the war from just simply a squabble among states to a totally new moral plane. And that's, as you rightly said, it's about the unifying of the North, the unifying of the freed slaves, the unifying of some of even the people of the southern states who were really not that keen on slavery themselves, that all of a sudden you had a moral crusade, which before then it was just a series of battles.
And then England couldn't get involved at all because they're like, whoa, wait a minute.
Yeah, it made the Confederacy radioactive to Europe. And that's that's one of the key things, is that there were obviously many pivotal battles and pivotal moments of the Civil War, but the moment the Emancipation Proclamation is issued, which is about a week after the Battle of Antietam, and then it's actually finalized the 1st of January 1863, the South is isolated. It's really a matter of time for the South to sink and to be defeated, because all of their potential diplomatic maneuvers, all their potential allies just vanish overnight.
And yet it still went on for another 3 years, which is,
Yes. Well, and there's a lot of reasons for that.
Yeah, I'm sure, I think we could discuss this for days and days and days. So let's back up a little bit. Tova, what would you like to ask?
Hi. So first of all, I really enjoyed your essay. It was super interesting. I was wondering if you could go more into, so for those of you who haven't read the essay, a big portion of the essay talks about how Abraham Lincoln tactically was thinking about issuing the Emancipation Proclamation as a way to galvanize the European states in support of the Union and turn them against the Confederacy by making the war about a moral issue instead of purely a political one. But I wanted you to talk more about why it was so important that the European states be on the Union side, because I know that when I learned about the Emancipation Proclamation in school, they kind of gloss over the European states' involvement, and people usually think about the Civil War as just an example of Americans fighting Americans and kind of don't even think about the European aspect at all. So why was it so important to Lincoln to have the Europeans on their side? And then once he made the Emancipation Proclamation, how did the European support of the Union affect the turn of the war?
Right, thank you. It was a great question. If people have studied the American Revolution, everyone remembers the Battle of Saratoga, where basically being defeated and surrendering a very large British force. And the French were watching the American Revolution. And the moment that Saratoga happens, King Louis XVI, thanks to Ben Franklin, brings French troops and the French fleet on behalf of the Americans, and that levels the playing field, and obviously goes all the way to the big battle, and in both the naval battle and then the land battle at Yorktown. And so the Confederates were hoping for kind of a Saratoga moment in the Civil War. They were hoping that the European, both France and England, of course, this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, they are using Confederate or Southern cotton to basically supply their textile mills, which is one of the big driving forces of economic expansion within Europe. And so the first year, there's a cotton glut. Their warehouses are full of cotton. The second year of the war, which is 1862, there is no cotton in their warehouses. They're desperate, and they would love to bring the Civil War to an end, and so that maybe forcing a negotiated peace so they could start getting cotton for their textile mills. So Europe is very important. If they came in on the side of the Confederacy, that would be kind of like that Saratoga moment. If they come in on the side of the Union, or at least remain neutral, then the South starts to shrivel, because right now, at the point when the Emancipation Proclamation is issued, England is running the blockade. They basically bring ships to Bermuda. They're running the blockade to the different southern ports, bringing in Enfield rifles and gunpowder and all sorts of other munitions to help the South, because there's a lot of people, because of the link to cotton, they want the South to be viable. The moment that the South is no longer viable because of the moral issue, then most of that supply gets cut off. And of course, then the South starts to lose a lot more battles.
You know, I was just reading here, you say in the early summer of 1862, bowing to political and economic pressure, Lord Palmerston drafted legislation to officially recognize the Confederate government.
That's right.
And press for.
Yes. Seward, who was, people remember Seward for the one who, he was Lincoln's Secretary of State, and he is famously known for buying Alaska from the Russians later on. But Seward and Palmerston were not, it was like oil and water. Every time that Seward sent a letter to Palmerston, he basically made him mad because he was just sort of saying domestic politics. And one of the big issues was in November of 1861. The South was sending delegations to England to basically open diplomatic channels to try to get England to side with the South. And you had the Trent Affair, as they call it. It was basically a British ship leaving from Havana with a number of, with two commissioners, or basically ambassadors from the South, to go to England to continue diplomatic discussions. And they are in international waters, they're captured by a US frigate. And everyone remembers that the main reason we fought the War of 1812 was England was stopping US ships that were technically neutral during the Napoleonic Wars. And that's why we fought the War of 1812. So here the tables are turned. A neutral ship, an English ship, is now captured an American frigate, and that's why it almost came to war of England with the North, because of this Trent Affair. So a lot of things were happening very early on in the war that were souring relationships between Europe and the North.
And so Palmerston, he drafted legislation to officially recognize the Confederate because he was mad about the Trent Affair. But
absolutely.
It never became official, though, did it? I mean,
no, he was basically looking, and this is why the Battle of Antietam is fought, is that England wanted to be on the winning side. And so they were looking at the southern battles that were being fought mostly around Richmond at this time, and of course Grant out on the Tennessee River and the Mississippi rivers. But the South was winning a lot of battles around Richmond, but they were not winning offensive battles, winning defensive battles. So basically Palmerston said, until the South really shows itself in a northern battlefield or an offensive campaign, I don't really want to back this horse. And so that's why he was waiting for something else to happen in the field.
So he drafted it, but he wasn't going to do anything with it. Yes,
until
Cathy?
Something happened.
Yes,
Well, I was wondering if we could just back up for a second, if Scott could explain just a little bit more about what exactly the Emancipation Proclamation was and what it did and didn't do. Because I was really interested to read in your essay, Scott, that it did not free slaves, I think, in maybe 5 states that were aligned with the Union. But it only freed states it only freed slaves in the states that were allied with the Confederacy. Would you mind just
Sure. Right. No problem there. The legal underpinnings and the reason for the Emancipation Proclamation is that literally the moment the Civil War began, especially because the Union, like they had Sumter down in Charleston Harbor, they also had Fort Monroe, which is part of the Chesapeake Bay area. And as the Confederates go into the field and a lot of these plantation owners start to join up to the war, less and less security is happening on these plantations. So a lot of slaves start escaping, and they of course run to the Union lines. And so the first thing in the Civil War in the field is, what do you do with all these escaped slaves? And so Benjamin Butler initially in Fort Monroe, and then other Union leaders in the field say, okay, we're going to look upon slaves as property, just like the South does. And if they come to us, it's just like us capturing a gun or a horse or some other of warfare, because the slaves working on the plantation are basically an asset to the Southern cause. So what do you do about it? How do you create a policy that guides all these different commanders when anywhere from a dozen to several hundred slaves all of a sudden come across the line and say, help us with a Union commander? So the Emancipation Proclamation is basically treating slaves as property and saying, you are a material of war. And if you come over to us, you're going to be part of the North. You're going to be free with us. We're freeing you. And then also any other slaves in the South, again, any state or territory that is in rebellion with the North, against the North, therefore, slaves are fair game. And so there were slaves in the North, very few, but there were still slaves in the North. So the Emancipation Proclamation was only there to basically be an enticement and a legal underpinning for allowing slaves in those areas under rebellion to flee into Union lines.
You know, I'm reading here too about I think it'd be cool, since we talk about the Constitution and the talk about the Constitution and the Emancipation Proclamation. And Dakare, I'm coming to you in 2 seconds. But you have this paragraph here. This seems to be when how Lincoln justified the Emancipation Proclamation with the Constitution, and that's in your fabulous, wonderful essay available at constitutingamerica.org. On July 22nd, 1862, Lincoln called a cabinet meeting to announce his intention to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And he framed it as an imperative of war. So you want to go into that?
Well, again, the issue is that the slaves were an asset. They were still running the plantations. They were still creating, bringing in the harvest, which in the case of especially any kind of food that's going to be feeding the Confederate forces, they're basically, some are pressed into service to basically dig trenches and things like that. So they are an asset of the Confederate government, of the Confederate armed forces. So Lincoln wants to pull the rug out from under the Confederacy by depriving them of this asset.
Right, and because he says here in his quote, well, here's his quote: "By virtue of the power in me vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States in time of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, and as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion." So that's exactly what you just described. He's suppressing the rebellion so that the South would not have all the benefits and that you just mentioned. Okay, Dakare, you're on.
Yes, sir. How are you doing? I also read your essay and it was very good.
Thank you.
So Cathy had asked you about how you mentioned in the essay, really it didn't allow a lot of slaves to be freed. Well, I don't know if you know this, but here in Charleston, I worked for a house and I was a pretty good expert on slavery and African Americans during that time here. And after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, this family that I was doing tours in their house, they actually owned, I think, about 84 slaves.
Wow.
After the Emancipation Proclamation, they believed that Lincoln didn't possess the power to basically, tell them they couldn't have slaves or free the slaves in these seceded states. Well, what they did was they used these things called slave tags. And basically what they did was they would tag their slaves And what that would allow them to do is the slaves had like a tag which had a number on it. And they would be able to trade them with different slave owners in Charleston. And they would tell the slaves that, okay, if you do this, we'll give you money, a percentage of the money to buy your freedom. But they weren't really giving them money to buy their freedom. So basically, they were trying to cheat the system. So my question to you is, do you think that, or how do you feel about Lincoln's power to free slaves in these seceded states?
Well, that's exactly why he did it as an active, as a action dealing with military assets. That there's another article I wrote for Constituting America several years ago, specific to the Emancipation Proclamation, that goes into a lot more of the legal discussions that happened in cabinet, where they were looking at, well, the South is still under the control of the Confederate government. How can a separate country, in essence, the North, do anything that shapes policy or property in a separate country, basically the Confederacy? But if you make it into something dealing with control of war material, so to speak, then you have that constitutional, because Lincoln was a constitutional scholar. He really was a person of the Enlightenment. He did not want to overreach within the federal government. He did not want to violate the Constitution. So that's why this whole concept of slaves being a war asset, just like a horse or a cow or or again, a piece of artillery, that gave him the legal basis. And also, obviously, you're only going to be able to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation if you capture territory and occupy those plantations or those communities where slaves are being held. So making it a war measure as opposed to something else gave him that constitutional underpinning.
I'm going to go to Tova in a second, but I want to go back a little bit to the series of battles here and how important battles were. And the tour, I guess, if someone bids on it in the auction would be fascinating. I've never done any of this. I'd love to do it too. But the series of battles that we had here, and I watched Ken Burns' documentary on the Civil War, which was just it was so brilliant. But I mean, 25,000 men would die in one battle. I think 23,000 died in one. But there's a little intrigue here, which is really fascinating. I'm not exactly sure which battle it is. And so I wanted to kind of spell out there are 2 or 3 battles that led to this pivotal moment where Lee really wanted to win it because he could show the foreigners that he was going to be the leader. And the North really wanted to win it because if they won it, they could get the European support. But also Seward wanted them to win it and said, don't do the Emancipation Proclamation until you win a battle, because when you win a battle, he wanted to give the Emancipation Proclamation before they won the battle, but Seward, Secretary of State Seward, said, no, win the battle, you'll be in a better position to declare this. So they all wanted to win these battles. And here, what's fascinating here, when I read this, England and France opted for neutrality. So right now they're trying to figure out who's going to win. And then it says, matters got worse. On November 8th, 1861, a Union naval warship, wait, where is it?
That's the Trent affair, yeah.
No, that's wrong then. Okay, but they lost the battle plans.
Yes.
The battle plans were lost.
That's one of the great mysteries.
That's lost.
Yeah.
So talk about that. Lee had his battle plans, which were probably, he was a brilliant commanding general, and they were lost, and the North got them, and that's how they could win. Talk about that.
Yes. One of the great mysteries of history is Lee issued this, Lost Order 191 is what's called. And so Lee is sitting in Frederick, Maryland, and his strategy is to draw McClellan and the Union Army deep into Western Maryland, closer to Lee's supply chain, far away from the Washington supply base for the Union, and destroy the Union Army. And that would be his Saratoga to interest Europe in coming in on the side of the South. And so he's sitting in Frederick, Maryland, and he knows that Harper's Ferry is sitting there with about a little over 12,000 soldiers and another 1,000 cavalry in his rear, and basically astride his supply line. So he needs to knock out Harper's Ferry as part of this pulling to the west and drawing McClellan deep into the mountains. But to do that, he has to break his army into 4 parts. So he writes these orders and he breaks his army up. And then a couple days later, after they leave Frederick, a Union patrol, basically 2 guys come across this wrapper with 3 cigars. And in the wrapper is this Order 191. It's one of the copies that was done and issued to his commanders. So to this day, we still do not know which commander lost that order. It's one of the great mysteries of history. But basically, I mean, you can think of any battle or any war in history. If all of a sudden you have in your hands the entire plan for the other side, where they're going to, what forces are where, and what day they're going to try to rendezvous and where they're going to rendezvous, that's a huge windfall. So that's what happens, is that McClellan, who was being very slow in the battle, I mean, he was a brilliant tactician and logistic person, but he was always very slow. All of a sudden he speeds up because he now knows exactly where Lee is and where all of Lee's forces are. And so you have this clock ticking, because all of a sudden Harper's Ferry has to fall quickly, and Lee is all of a sudden having to defend 3 passes on the Catoctin Mountains and South Mountain, because the full force of the Union Army is pouring through Frederick and pushing out to the west, knowing that Lee's divided in 4 parts. So on the 14th of September, 3 days before the main battle of Antietam, you literally have warfare, a big battle happening at Harper's Ferry, where the siege is happening, and Jackson, who's in charge of taking Harper's Ferry, has divided his forces into 3 parts to surround Harper's Ferry. They're bombarding and pushing in on Harper's Ferry, and they're listening to gunfire on South Mountain, which is about 8 miles away, and they're looking. There's literally a place at Harper's Ferry that you can stand and you can see South Mountain, and you can also see one of the mountains over by Antietam. So you can literally understand how all these different battles are literally within eyesight of each other. Certainly they're hearing gunfire from each other and cannon fire from each other, realizing how the clock is ticking to try to get Harper's Ferry neutralized, defend these passes along South Mountain, and then pull back to Sharpsburg along the Antietam River and rendezvous fast enough before McClellan and his forces crush the Confederacy. It'd be a great movie.
Yeah, yes, it would. I mean, to think it was rolled up in 3 cigars and lost, and
Yes.
How do you think that person felt? I think, wow, it's just a providential, really. You know, it just, I think that seems like it was meant to happen because
Right.
slavery needed to end in the country.
Right.
And think about it, if that hadn't have been lost, we may have, the Confederacy.
Yeah, I mean, Lee would have been able to have taken out Harper's Ferry at his leisure, rendezvoused, and then pulled McClellan west and probably crushed him. But because Lee was all of a sudden thrown off his game, McClellan had a shot to actually do things.
So the dropping or whatever happened with those 3 rolled cigars and someone actually finding them. If you just think of that, to me, it's God in action. Okay, Tova.
Right, so you talk a lot in your essay about how the Emancipation Proclamation affected the North. Like, you talk about how it got a lot of European nations on the side of the Northern armies, how it encouraged abolitionists within the Union to stand up and start the fight, and like really increased morale and got people like all fired up to take on the South. But I was wondering if you could talk more about how the Emancipation Proclamation affected the South. How did it affect morale? Did it like motivate Southerners to fight against the Union, or did it decrease morale? Did it not have a huge effect because the Union Army hadn't taken over those territories yet? Like, what was the atmosphere there?
It certainly incensed the South. I mean, I think in many ways it probably built morale for the South, because now all of a sudden it wasn't just simply, again, a war between the states, but they're now sitting there going that they know that if they get defeated, that even if there's a negotiated settlement, slavery is going to end. And so their way of life, their economic base for everything is going to vanish. So the South probably motivated the South more, but also at the same time, because there was not necessarily any clear idea that if I'm a slave and all of a sudden the plantation is emptied out of white men because they've gone off to war, I don't know what's going to happen to me if I run toward the Union lines. Now I do. And so it actually increased the number of slaves that were willing to leave their plantation and flee to the Union lines. So a lot of those kind of pieces were definitely there. Now, the other piece is certainly the amount of supplies coming in from Europe dried up overnight. And so while there were still some privateers and blockade runners who, because it was very lucrative to bring supplies into the South, it probably cut it by almost 80%. And so the South really had the rug pulled out from under them.
Think of that image too. I see everything, you know, of everyone fleeing to get to the North, and because they knew they would have freedom when they got there. But think about how dangerous that was.
Absolutely.
You know, it's a long way from the South. How many actually did try to flee during the war? Do we know? I mean, because depending on where you are, if you're in Georgia, that's a long way to go, you know?
Right. Well, of course, a lot of people probably saw the film Glory, which was done about showing the first major African-American regiment within the Civil War. By the end of the war, and this is one of the other things that Lincoln was really strong on, and also I'm almost finished with the book by Chernow on Grant, which is an absolutely spectacular book. And Grant was very, very keen on bringing freed slaves into the Union Army. So by the end of the war, almost 300,000 slaves or freedmen were part of the Union Army. When you start to look at the Union Army was still about 1 million people, but almost a third of it was now either freed African Americans who were already free in the North, like in the film Glory, or escaped slaves who are now being given weapons and be able to retake the land that they just fled from. So a very significant number of.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, Cathy.
Well, I was wondering, I guess President Lincoln issued sort of a test, or maybe these days we would call it a soft rollout of the Emancipation Proclamation, 5 days after the battle?
Exactly.
But it actually didn't go into effect until January 1.
That's right.
Why do you think he waited so long, and why did they have that waiting period?
Good question. I think it was just he wanted to get the word out so it could get, because it took like a month or so to get the word out. So he wanted to get the word out fast. And then he wanted to kind of dot the I's and cross the T's and have the formal memos that went out to every commander and to every state in the North, and also being able to craft something that would then go out into the South through his spy network and others to get the word out. So I think it's a different era. They didn't have their cell phones. They did have telegraph, but it was a much slower pace of getting the word out. And he wanted to actually have a formally, engrossed document that could be replicated and spread.
Do you think he hoped that maybe the war would have been over by then? Because I think it said in the Emancipation Proclamation that it would only go into effect if the southern states were still in rebellion. So
I think that certainly after the first year of the war, everyone knew this thing wasn't going to end fast. As you'll have several other essays coming up, the fact that Atlanta fell, and that's what really saved his reelection. And then just like Antietam and all that really happened to help save his congressional off-year elections. So everything kind of weaves together that you still had, that's the other thing which is really amazing, is that everyone talks today about the COVID-19 isolation, and we're going to delay, they've delayed some primaries. We were in a civil war, and we still had off-year elections for Congress and Senate. We still had a presidential election in '64. Just think about that you had all these people, over 700,000 people dying And percentage-wise, that was like 5% of the population at the time. And all of these people under arms and all these battles happening, and we still had a congressional election in 62 and a presidential in 64.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. So I want to talk about the Russian involvement, and I want to turn it. I want Dakare to ask probably one of the final last questions here. It was so fascinating to read. I just finished a great book called Gentlemen in Moscow. I don't know if anyone's read that book. Have you read it? Have you read it, Tova? Oh my gosh. Okay, it's really, really good. But it's interesting to me. And this would be also a question about the states that then coalesced around the North after the Emancipation Proclamation and how they helped the North, because the French were so, we won that pivotal battle with Washington in Saratoga, and so then we got the French, and so now the emancipation happened after Antietam and everything was a draw technically, but because there was a retreat and all this, everyone felt like the North, they were the winners. But how did the foreign countries help at that point? But what's interesting to me is Russia. You talk about, let's see, European nations flocked to embrace Lincoln and his Emancipation Crusade. One vivid example was Tsar Alexander II, who had emancipated Russia's serfs, becoming a friend of Lincoln. And in the fall of 1863, he, being the Russian Tsar, sent Russian fleets to New York City and San Francisco to support the Union cause. I thought, oh, there are those Russians again.
Well, Alexander II freed the serfs, and he was a great reformer. And he and Lincoln actually had a very warm and constant correspondence after the Emancipation Proclamation, and because he saw a kindred soul. And of course, what is really ironic in history, Lincoln gets assassinated in the early 1880s. Tsar Alexander II also gets assassinated. So there's a lot of interesting historic parallels.
I didn't know that he was assassinated too.
Yeah, he was. They threw a bomb under his carriage in St. Petersburg.
Who's they? The aristocrats who were mad.
You had, these are where you had you had all those people who just wanted to sow chaos, and so you had a lot of assassinations in the last part of the 19th century, where you had people who just simply just wanted to sow chaos. They had no real ideological background, and so you had a number of monarchs killed over a 20-year period, because these anarchists just wanted to sow anarchy, and which is so sad, because Tsar Alexander II was a real reformer. His son totally reversed everything, and then his son, Tsar Nicholas II, was of course the one who gets involved in the Bolshevik Revolution and gets killed. And so had that bomb not gone off, Russia might have had a very different history.
Wow. There you go.
But the issue is that because of this warm relationship that grew between the Tsar and the President Lincoln, the Tsar said, is there anything I can do? And Lincoln said, well, we're really spread thin with our naval blockade, and so he sends the Russian fleet into New York Harbor and the Russian fleet into San Francisco Bay to basically help with coastal patrols and just sort of show the flag.
Yeah, because San Francisco, it was, that's interesting. Okay, I won't go into that weed, because San Francisco was, okay, Dakare.
Yes, sir. So I find it very interesting when she talks about Russia and how they kind of, latched on to Lincoln's ideals and what Lincoln was doing. I actually was in The King and I twice. And in The King and I, there are many references to slavery in Abraham Lincoln. Absolutely. So I did some research to see if that was actual truth, and it is. So my question to you is, why in the East was Lincoln such this cultural influence? Because, it seems like he influenced the whole globe. with this Emancipation Proclamation?
Well, again, it's one of the, I mean, think of it, it's the first, everyone, looks at, back during Roman times, you had Spartacus, and so there were slave rebellions. There was a slave rebellion that basically toppled the French government in Haiti in the early 19th century. But to have an actual country focus a major war where literally hundreds of thousands of people are dying on behalf of freeing an oppressed people, that was war was never really framed that way. War was usually about just gaining territory and other kind of political power. And so, America first has its Revolutionary War, which is a people wanting to be free, and then it has its Civil War that ultimately, thanks to the Emancipation Proclamation, is about helping other people be free. I mean, that starts to get into the whole issue of American exceptionalism, that our birth war was about freedom, and our defining war, Civil War, was about freedom, ultimately. And I think that that's what makes Lincoln such a cultural phenomenon worldwide, because it's just unheard of, especially in the 19th century, for a leader to wage total war to free a people.
Fascinating. That's just the coolest thing I think you've said tonight. I think that's really really great. Cathy, may I go to Tova, or you have a burning question, Cathy?
No, go to Tova.
Okay, Tova.
Great. So yeah, this whole discussion of Lincoln and just this giant paradigm shift is just so interesting to me. So thank you for bringing that up. I was wondering if you could talk more about Lincoln himself. Was he always an abolitionist? Was that his intention going into the war? Like at the start of his political career, was that where he was? He wanted to abolish slavery, or did he start more conservative and slowly become abolitionist? Like what was his ideological journey?
Right. He was, again, the Republican Party that was formed in 1854, it wasn't an abolitionist party per se. I mean, there was a kind of a radical faction that wanted slavery abolished everywhere. But the real battle was over where slavery expand. And of course, after the Mexican War, all of a sudden you have all of this new land to the west of the Louisiana Purchase. And even the Louisiana Purchase, you have a lot of settlers pushing westward past the Mississippi. And does slavery go west with settlement? And that's really where the defining moment was. That's what destroyed the Whig Party. That's what shattered the Democratic Party. That's what created the Republican Party. And so most Republicans, and of course, Lincoln was a Whig who became a Republican, like most Republicans at that time in the 1850s, it was all about, you don't want slavery to expand past its current area, which was the South and some of the border states. And so that was, at the time, still considered a radical notion, because a lot of people said, well, let slavery expand where it wants to. And so that was the big debate. 1840s, Compromise of 1850, Missouri Compromise, all these different battles in the Senate. And again, destroyed the Whig Party, shattered the Democratic Party, launched the Republican Party. And so it wasn't until the Emancipation Proclamation that slavery was now being looked upon as, we need to abolish it completely. And of course, later on, January 1865, Lincoln and what they called the radical Republicans pushed the 13th Amendment, which actually does abolish slavery everywhere in the United States. So it was an evolutionary thing that was only, I mean, you have like the John Brown raid and others who had straight abolitionists who wanted it gone everywhere immediately, but that was a very small faction that grew over time.
Yeah, and we discussed that last week with his Cooper Union address, how he was stating that he didn't want the expansion of slavery, and he rolls out in the Cooper Union address about how the founding fathers, actually, the majority of them did not want slavery and they didn't want it to expand. It was really, Cooper Union address was pretty cool too. Okay, so we have a remaining like 7 minutes. So I mean, we may have a question from, if anyone in the audience would like to ask a quick question, go to your Q&A and write it in, and Cathy can be looking at that. And Mr. Faulkner, in closing here, is there anything that you would love to say that we didn't ask tonight about the Emancipation Proclamation or this fabulous, wonderful essay? It's just so filled with intrigue, these battles. Anything that we didn't touch on that you think is very important that you'd like to discuss?
Well, I think that for everybody who's in the audience, if they're good readers, you need to read. This is the book about all of the geopolitics of the Civil War. It's a fantastic book. Also, if you only have to read one book on the Civil War, Battle Cry of Freedom by James McPherson remains the classic, and both books obviously focus a lot on the Emancipation Proclamation, looking upon Antietam as the pivotal battle of the Civil War. Again, Gettysburg is the biggest battle that ever happened in North America, which is why people all know about Gettysburg. But in terms of strategic impact, in terms of global impact, it's Antietam and the battles leading up to Antietam that really does redefine America, redefine the Civil War, and in many ways redefines the world.
Now, you wrote one of those books, right? Can you give us those titles again?
I didn't write these books. No, these aren't my books. This is James McPherson is probably one of the most revered scholars on the Civil War. He's and I quote him and cite him in my articles. Again, if you're only going to read one book in your entire life on the Civil War, this is the book to read.
Battle Cry of Freedom. Okay.
And then the other one is, if you want to read about the geopolitics of the war, this is the book, which just goes into all sorts of detail about the French, about the Dutch, about the Russians, about the English, and it really is the definitive book on the geopolitics of the Civil War.
So that's what was fascinating, I think, in this article that too. You talked about the battles, but you also talked about the international intrigue around it. So the second book, A World on Fire.
A World on Fire by Amanda Foreman. She wrote the book on the Duchess of Devonshire and several other major books. She's a British historian.
So fascinating. Okay, great. So Cathy, do we have a question from our viewers tonight?
Yes, we have a question from a student, actually one of our contest winners, Nathan Copeland, who is our best STEM winner. And Nathan writes, the U.S. had a merry-go-round of generals that didn't perform well on the battlefield, extending the time frame of the war. Why did Lincoln go through so many generals? And then he said, I know this isn't emancipation specific, but it did make the war long enough to refocus the war on slavery, which is a really good point.
The U.S. military was very political. And so you had a lot of what they call political generals, not just the main commanders, like people like McClellan, who ultimately ran against Lincoln for president in '64, but Hooker and all of these others. They were in fact, the book on Grant that I'm reading right now by Chernow gets into how Grant was unique because he was sitting out there in the West, and most people kind of ignored the West until Vicksburg happens. And so it gave him a chance to build his basically command structure with Sheridan and Sherman and others. And so when he's finally brought east to run the war in the final year, he has his act together, so to speak. But all these other commanders, most of them really weren't committed to total war. Many of them had Southern brides or Southern relatives. And so they were trying to fight more of a gentleman's war. And it ultimately became clear that to really win against the Confederacy, it had to become total war. And Grant was the total war person. And of course, with Sherman's March to the Sea, but also Sheridan's Valley Campaign in the Shenandoah Valley during the same period, you're dealing with total warfare. And that was ultimately what had to happen to crush the South completely. So you had this merry-go-round of political generals, merry-go-round of generals who they would get defeated along the Rappahannock or get defeated at the gates of Richmond and immediately retreat back north. Grant was relentless, and every time he and Lee fought during the spring of 1864, he was, he basically just kept going south. He just kept flanking Lee south, and that was something that threw Lee's game off because Lee had never encountered such a relentless warrior as Grant. And that's what ultimately won the war.
That was fascinating answer too. That was really, really, thank you for that question. And that was a great answer. You know, when you said McClellan was one of his generals who ran against him for president.
Yeah, he was the Democratic nominee in 1864, and they ran as a peace platform, saying, if you elect me, I will immediately start negotiations with the South and end this bloodshed. So McClellan, he was always nasty to Lincoln behind the scenes. He was a bit of a backstabber. And so the ultimate backstab was he was the Democrat against Lincoln in the 1864 general election.
Wow. You know, I read Ron Chernow's book on Washington, which is another great book. I have the Grant book you talked about right up here.
Yeah,
I have it right here.
I read Hamilton last year. That's an amazing one.
Yeah. But the Washington book is a read everybody should read by Ron Chernow. It was just amazing.
Absolutely.
But think about all the things that Washington was up against. And one of the things was about everybody, the lack of loyalty within his own ranks, and the generals that were vying for power, people that were trying to get his power.
Gates wanted, after Saratoga, Gates said, I should run everything, not Washington. I mean, there's a lot of rivalry.
A lot of rivalry. And then so here it happens with Lincoln too. Wow. I tell you what, anyone who runs this country, or, you know, as a president, has to be tough.
Tough,
right?
Very tough.
Let's give a big hand for Scot Faulkner. You were terrific.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
This was a great night. Thank you so much. And thank you for recommending those books. And I encourage everyone, do you have a place you want us to send everyone for you, a website, or?
Well, actually, what I do is I write a blog called Citizen Oversight, which is about basically holding power accountable at all levels. And a lot of the essays that I've done for Constituting America are also reprinted on there, but I also write articles dealing with just more contemporary politics. And so if you go on to Blogspot, Citizen Oversight, and just Google Citizen Oversight, one word, and Faulkner, it'll pop up. There's almost 300 articles on there.
Wow. Okay, we're going to do that. And Tova and Dakare, we always call, Cathy and I call them and say, what topic is interesting to you both? And so we'll have them go to your website and your blog, and we'll pick an article and have you come back. If you don't mind, we'd love to have
Wonderful.
you come back.
This has been a lot of fun.
What a fun, wonderful time. Thank you, everybody.